As crazy as it might sound, I think Trump may have just solved the Israeli-Gaza conflict. And I'm not even joking. I mean, on the surface, it sounds crazy. It actually sounds a little bit immoral. But I'm going to explain how his potential solution is not only the most sensible solution that we've heard in decades, but also there's precedent. It's not the first time it's been floated. So I'm going to tell you what's happened, and then I'm going to talk you through the history, explore some of the moral questions around it, and then discuss the feasibility and how practical it actually would be to implement and what that implementation could look like. So what am I talking about? What's happened? Well, Trump was traveling on Air Force One yesterday when he told reporters that he'd been speaking to King Abdullah of Jordan about relocating Gaza's displaced people to Jordan and to Egypt. Now, we all know the story. There's a huge percentage of Gaza's population have been displaced because of the war that Hamas brought to their doorstep. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled to the ground, and it's going to take decades to rebuild. The UN estimates it's going to cost $80 billion to rebuild. Remember this number, because this number is actually very important. I'm going to come back to this later in the video. But there's a huge cost attached to the rebuild, and it's going to take decades to rebuild. Rebuilding roads, hospitals, all kinds of infrastructure, power plants, like everything a society needs, from the kitchen in someone's apartment to the roads, needs to be rebuilt. That's going to take time and it's going to cost money. So what do you do with the 2 million people that live in Gaza while this is happening? Are they going to live in tents? Are they going to, like, it's a logistically, practically, it's a huge nightmare. And so Trump came up with the idea of relocating the displaced Gazans to another country. Now, on the surface, that might sound like what the anti-Zionists have been charging Israel with from the very beginning. They said this war was always about Israel trying to ethnically cleanse the Arabs who lived in Gaza.
The place is unlivable. And the reason it's unlivable is because they're trying to cleanse Gaza.
I'm going to show you how that is not the case. And actually, this, if implemented correctly, is a moral solution. So let me explain. Let's first look at the history. It may surprise you to learn who one of the first major proponents of population transfers in this territory were. It wasn't America. It wasn't the Zionists. It was actually, you sitting down? You're not actually going to be that surprised. It was Britain. In 1937, in the Peel Commission, Britain said the following: if partition is to be effective in promoting a final settlement, it must mean more than drawing a frontier and establishing two states. Sooner or later, there should be a transfer of land and, as far as possible, an exchange of population. Did you catch that? It literally says in black and white, an exchange of population. Now, to our modern sensitivities, that sounds immoral. That sounds like ethnic cleansing. But back then, population transfers were not just accepted, they were actually seen as one of the most ethical solutions to ethno-violence. So I'll give you the example of when you have two children fighting, do you just let them continue to fight if they're unable to exist in the same space? No, you separate them. You move one child into one room and another child into the other room so they can't fight. And that's exactly the approach that was taken by many statesmen in the 20th century. I'll give you some examples. Between 1919 and 1922, you had the Greco-Turkish War. After that war, there was a transfer of 1.6 million Turks and Greeks between the respective territories to avoid further clashes. This was seen as a largely successful initiative because the two nations were able to arrive at peace, they stopped fighting, they were able to establish relations, and it wasn't the only example. In the wake of World War II, Europe saw its largest population transfer, and in most instances this was a forced population transfer of ethnic Germans from Eastern and Central Europe. And that wasn't the last example. Actually, in 1947, a year before the State of Israel was born, Pakistan was carved out of India and millions of people were transferred again. This was a very common solution during this period. But obviously, the world has moved on, and we look at those solutions today with serious concern. Why should an elderly woman who's lived on the land for generations be forced to leave her country, forced to leave her home because her neighbors are fighting her other neighbors? That doesn't seem very moral. Now, I imagine that's what most people think of when they hear of this plan. They think that Trump is suggesting that we force an elderly grandma who doesn't want to leave her house to go and live in Jordan. And I think there would be some serious concerns with that. I personally wouldn't sign up to such a solution. However, I think there's a much more intelligent way of approaching this problem. And I think that's what Trump is proposing. So let's first and foremost, before getting into the moral nature of what's being proposed here and how it could be potentially implemented in a practical way, let's look at the two territories, Jordan and Egypt. So Jordan in particular has a population of 11 million. Around 70% of those people are Palestinian already. So it's not like there aren't already Palestinians in Jordan. The majority of the population is Palestinian. And actually, the remainder who aren't Palestinian are still Palestinian, and I'll explain what I mean. Back in the early 1920s, when Britain first carved Jordan out of British Mandatory Palestine, the people that were living in that land, in Jordan, were no different from the people that were living in the remainder of the land. So the Britain called it East and Western Palestine. The Arabian family, the Hashemites that took over the territory, who were given the territory, they renamed it the Emirate of Jordan. But ignoring the name, the people, not the ruling family, but the people, were no different to the people living on the other side. The Arabs were the same, be they in Nablus or be they in Amman. And so you already have Palestinians living there. And there's more than enough space to accommodate many, many more people. It's a very large territory. It's much bigger than the West Bank, much bigger than Israel, much bigger than Gaza, much bigger than all three of them combined. And so there's a lot more space. Not only that, and this is where it becomes very interesting as a solution. The rebuild cost of Gaza, as I mentioned earlier, is put at $80 billion, according to the United Nations. Now, that's not going to be overnight. You need to rebuild schools, roads, power plants, waterworks, sewage works. The entire nation has to be rebuilt. This is not just going to take billions of dollars, but it's going to take decades. So in the meantime, all of these displaced Gazans need access to a good standard of living. They need access to water, clean water, electricity, just the basic necessities. And you're going to find that in some tents in refugee camps on the coast. It's just not practical to house that many people at the standard which they would need to be housed at to avoid outbreaks of diseases, overcrowding, poverty. Well, I mean, how are people going to work? It's not feasible. So there needs to be a practical solution to this very real problem. And this is where it becomes very interesting. Let's say that instead of spending $80 billion to rebuild Gaza, we do a little math. There are 400,000 households in Gaza. Now, if each of those households was offered $200,000 to start a new life, buy a new home in Jordan or Egypt, all of that money would go directly into the pockets of the displaced family. You see, these families have been trapped. They've been trapped by Hamas. They've been trapped by Egypt. The border's sealed. They can't escape. They may despise Hamas, but there aren't elections to replace Hamas. The border isn't open with Egypt, so they can't just sail through into Egyptian territory. No, they've been stuck under the tyranny of Hamas with no means of escaping. And Hamas continuously drag these civilians into war. The latest war that Hamas dragged them into caused devastation on an unprecedented level in Gaza. And if I was a family living there, and I had young children, elderly parents, I would be thinking, do I want to have my house rebuilt in Gaza to remain under the boot of Hamas without any freedoms, without any economic opportunities, as I watch Hamas's leadership fly around the world in private jets with their billion-dollar bank accounts and luxury hotels while I can barely feed my family? Do I want to remain under them? Or Would I rather have $200,000 to start again in Jordan or Egypt? I know where I would personally go. Now, you're obviously going to get people who are nationalistic and want to see the rebuilding of Gaza. They've stayed there for generations. They've weathered storm after storm and they want to remain there, and fine. They have every right to remain there. But for those that want to escape the tyranny of Hamas, and for those that want to rebuild and start a new opportunity, a voluntary offer of $200,000 to restart your life in Jordan seems one of the most practical solutions we've had to date. There's no ethnic cleansing, nobody would be forced. It gives those that are trapped under Hamas the opportunity to flee. And we've all seen videos like this one.
شوف حماس بمزوق حماس وايش يفضح ارضهم اليوم الحماس.
What happens to those guys now? What happens to those now that Hamas are back in control? What about all those Gazans who spoke to the press and said they were so relieved that Hamas were being driven out of Gaza, only to find themselves trapped under Hamas again? Having said that to the press, their lives are in danger. I'm sure every single one of them would rather take $200,000 and restart their life in Jordan. So, should the international community pour $80 billion back into Gaza with Hamas still in charge, so Hamas invite another war onto the doorstep and it all gets ruined again in 15 years' time? Or would the international community be better posed to put that money into relocating those that voluntarily want to escape the conflict, want to escape Hamas, and want to restart their lives? Voluntarily being the operative word, at least for me. I don't believe in a forced transfer. I believe that's immoral. I believe an innocent civilian should not be forced from their home if they had no part to play in the conflict. However, Hamas did bring devastation to their doorstep, and Gaza is going to be unlivable for many years. Things that you and I take for granted aren't available to many Gazans, things like clean water and electricity. So if someone living under those conditions wants to relocate on either a permanent or temporary basis to somewhere like Jordan or Egypt, then that's a good thing. And I think that is the genius of Trump's plan. He's come with something innovative that no one else is talking about, and it actually gives the people of Gaza an opportunity that wouldn't otherwise be there. And so I think this is good. I think the war has been terrible, and we need to focus on what happens next. And I think this is a good solution. So let me know if you agree with me in the comments below. I wanna hear what you think of Trump's plan. But if you have liked the message, or you like the videos that we make in general, then you can help us make more of them by contributing via this link. And together we can try and shape a better future for our children.